So today we're going to talk about this article on the criminalization of immigration. And then I would specifically like to also get done chapter 5 of Collins. But we'll see how far we get, because there's some issues that we kind of have to tackle that will draw us into stuff a little more deeply. So. Okay, so the article, the criminalization of immigration and the privatization of immigration detention. So let's just sort of start out by opening it up to you all. So what is our article discussing? What are the two things?
Talks about like the mass incarceration of illegal immigrants amongst like private prisons, not necessarily like federal funded ones, but ones that are more like, I guess, business type ran, lack of a better way to say it. But
Yeah, so one of our issues is the rise of private prisons, and to some degree the rise and decline of private prisons. So what are private prisons? Do people know this? This was a big thing in the news a couple years ago. What makes a private prison different?
It's not owned by the state, it's run by like private companies that profit off of having prisoners.
Yeah, traditionally, who runs prisons? Traditionally speaking. The state, right? And so the state, and this is connected to a process called neoliberalism, which we'll have to talk about, right? That, in essence, what happens is the state has privatized prisons. So they no longer run it, instead they're being run by some third-party corporation, right? So so the controversy, what generally happened when prisons privatized? What disappeared? What might be some problems maybe privatizing a prison? You already guessed. So general rule, we don't talk about it in sociology unless it's a problem.
One problem would be that like they profit off of having prisoners, and so if they don't have any prisoners, then they're not going to make any profit. So they need like a quota that they kind of have to fill. They're going to keep it running.
Yeah. So yeah, totally. So you have to keep your numbers high. Okay, so if you're a company, what do you always have to be doing if you want to survive as a company? That state organizations don't have to do. You have to make money, right? But can you just make the same amount of money, just stay stagnant, do the same amount of business over time? What's going to happen if you do the same amount of business over time? Especially if you're a publicly traded company. People are going to sell off their stocks, and you're going to collapse as a company, right? You have to be essentially have to have market expansion. You have to constantly be growing. We exist in a growth economy, right? So if you're not growing, you will disappear as a company, right? Particularly a publicly traded company. So what's an issue for a publicly traded prison company? What's a danger to that? What does that mean? That this company has to expand its markets. It has to make more and more money over time, or it's going to collapse. What's the danger of that? What does it need to do?
Well, like get more prisoners, or like keep them longer.
Yeah, in essence, what they have to do is the company has to have more prisoners over time, or it's not going to be a viable company. Is that a model you necessarily want for prisons? No, right? So that's the one issue that's in play here. Okay, So I made mention of neoliberalism. Do you guys know what neoliberal? Because this neoliberalism is going to play into both ends of this question, both sides of what this article is looking at. So does anybody ever heard this term before? I see a couple of nods. Anyone want to venture a guess of what neoliberalism is? Something from one of their other classes, maybe? No? Has anybody ever heard of austerity before? Okay. So neoliberalism is essentially what's happening. So thinking about privatization, right? Essentially, this is a part of the process of something called neoliberalism, where governments are essentially, in a lot of ways, shrinking in their control. That over time, what our governments do and what they don't do, right? Essentially, governments are doing less and less. More and more is getting pushed off into other sectors, right? Government oversight is shrinking over time. Things are becoming less regulated, particularly for companies over time. All this is a process referred to as neoliberalism, right? So neoliberalism is essentially the scaling back, the wholesale scaling back of government services. Make sense? So, and a lot of people have, particularly in recent years, talked about the decline of the nation state. Are we moving towards a society in which the government is less the authority in the world? Different governments are less the authority, and we're more and more just sort of being run by large multinational corporations. Right? We can think about almost any sector of the government, right? And in essence, we've seen things slide out of the government control and into private companies' control. This is even true of things like the military, right? At one time, do you guys ever hear about surrounding stuff like World War II, right? Not only was the government running the military, right, but all those things being built, right? Essentially, the government had oversight over everything being built, right? So they're being built in factories in the United States, but essentially the government was like, okay, General Motors, you need to stop making cars, and now you need to make machine guns, right? And essentially this sort of like top down, the government was essentially behind the entire production machine. If you were to compare what happened in the Iraq War to what happened in World War II, you can see essentially the privatization of the military. Not only do you have things like not all the forces in the military were actually run by the government. We hired a lot of mercenaries for the Iraq War, which is a part of a privatization thing, right? Essentially, there's this third-party corporation that's being paid for supplying soldiers, right? It's no longer being run by the government. They no longer have government oversight over what those soldiers were doing. A lot of the issues in Iraq actually stemmed from that, right? Then also, you get things like all of the things that were produced and used by soldiers were no longer being created and made by the government, like it was in World War II, but were being created and made by other companies, right? Specifically, the one that hit the news a lot was Halliburton, right? And Halliburton used government funds, often in a far more expensive way than if the government would have produced it itself, right? To create all the things that were being used by the military, right? So this is a good example, right? So regardless of what sector we're talking about, whether we're talking about the military, whether we're talking about policing, whether we're talking about prisons, whether we're talking about social services, social work, healthcare, in particular the treatment of people with mental disabilities, right? All this is increasingly not being done by the government, and instead being done by some third-party corporation, which makes profit off of it. Which on one hand makes it more expensive, and on the other hand takes it out of the control of the state. So what happens in the prison is no longer policed by government regulation if it's a private company. They just pay them, right? And whatever happens there is what happens there, right? Make sense? So, okay, so this is the one side of the issue. I said neoliberalism was going to work for both sides of our issues, that this is dancing behind it. What's the other thing that we're looking at? So we have private prisons, the rise of private prisons. But what does that have to do with immigration? So what's the issue with immigration that this is talking about? This article. Where do you see? If you guys want a page number, good spot to start is this 253. The first paragraph under the italicized subheading. Yeah.
Does it talk about like the bad treatment to like immigrant people in like detention centers?
So we're getting up to that, but there's another issue. Is it illegal to be an illegal immigrant? That sounds like a funny connection. What's that?
I'd say yes.
Traditionally, what has that fallen under? Just look through that paragraph.
Oh, I think it said like administration or something. A violation from yeah, to criminal. So it's like a criminal or something.
So traditionally, being an illegal immigrant is considered, at a federal level, is considered an administrative violation. So this puts it, and they compare it to, it's in the same class of actions, like it's technically like not supposed to happen, but it's like not turning your taxes in on time, right? So it's not something that's been traditionally policed by criminal law, right? So it's not a criminal activity, it's an administrative breach. It's like not filing your census, right? If you think about it that way, it'd be the same thing, right? So like, if you don't file your census, your census paperwork, like you're in violation of something the government is asking you to do, but you don't get arrested for it, and you don't get stuck in prison for it, right? You don't get detained for not turning your taxes in on time, you just get fined, right? Make sense? So traditionally it's been held as an administrative violation. It's not under criminal statutes. And so there's a shift here. Did anybody catch what this shift is? So that's at the federal level. Things stay the same. So technically speaking, it is still to this day not illegal to be an illegal immigrant, right? Your status is not as outside of the law, right? But it's just an administrative violation. So what did they do? What changed? And this happened at the state level, not at the federal level. Anybody catch this? If not, look through that section. See if you can pull out what's happening. Yeah?
They made it harder for like undocumented immigrants to get jobs and just like live within the state.
Yeah, so they made it harder. Specifically, how did they make it harder? I'll put it this way. Can states make it illegal to be an illegal immigrant? Can they criminalize it directly? Not directly. They can't just be like, okay, if you cross the border, bam, we're going to lock you up and throw you in prison. They can't do that. But what can they do?
You talked a little bit about like schools checking the status of like immigrant students.
So yeah, schools checking the status so that they have to report back. There's this whole thing about driver's license. Did anybody catch this?
It's a felony for them to get a driver's license and a business license.
Yeah. So what they did is they basically took things around the lives of illegal immigrants and turned them into criminal offenses. So they specifically made laws that didn't make it illegal to be an illegal immigrant, but made just them going about their day-to-day lives illegal, right? And one of the big ones is that they made it a felony for somebody without legal status in the United States to try to get a driver's license. So what does that mean? How easy is it to get around the United States without a driver's license? Especially if you're like an agricultural worker or something. How easy is it to get around without a driver's license? In general. It's hard, right? So like what position does that put people who are illegal immigrants? What do they have to do, no matter what?
Break the law.
Yeah, they're forced into a position, this is the point, right? And this is what they mean by the criminalization of immigration. They essentially put immigrants in the position where they have to break the law. They don't have a choice, right? They either drive without a license or they get a license and drive, both of which are illegal, right? So it becomes this sort of catch-22. So there's a series of policies coming out of, at the state level, right? And this is the examples they gave were particularly from Arizona and Alabama, but they're all over the United States this has been happening, right? Where essentially the state will just literally make it so that no matter what, illegal immigrants have to break the law. And that way they can just arrest them and detain them, right? Make sense? So we have the criminalization of so we have the criminalization of immigrants. Which actually ends up becoming like this weird feedback loop, right? So like, you think about too, like even how we talk about immigrants today, right? We talk about them as criminals because they are immigrants, right? So often they become threatening criminals because they are immigrants, right? Even if, right, it's the only criminal action is the fact that they are here, right? So, okay, so this also ties in with the decline of the nation state in a certain way, which begs the question, why do we have immigration? Why do people come to another country? What do you think? So we're getting down to causes. They nod at this, that, you know, worldwide you have more flow between countries than you used to. Right? Why is that? What do you think? Why would people be more likely to move from one place to another? Yeah.
Like, this is just a guess, but like maybe like to get work, or like if they're like countries like oppressing them.
Yeah, so you do get like refugee groups, right? These are groups that essentially like come because of oppression, right? Which we can tie into this, but it'll be a little more complicated. And your first one was work, right? Why do most people come to a country? It's what?
Get a better life.
To make money, right? So I'll just give you an example. Like I used to work at a factory. Did I talk about this at all? I used to work at a pickle factory. I did. Were you nodding yes? Right? And so like a lot of the people there were essentially immigrants from Mexico, right? A lot of which didn't have legal status. They didn't want to be here. They didn't want to stay here. They just wanted to make money and go back to Mexico, right? That's what most people who live abroad are doing, right? Essentially what they're doing is they're just taking advantage of the fact that they can make more money in a different situation, right? That's why actually like immigration follows market rises and declines. So like, you know, in 2008 when we went into decline in the United States, our immigration rates dropped a lot, right? So we had less and less people coming up here to work. Why was that? Because there was less of an opportunity to make money here than there was before, right? So generally speaking, people travel because they need to make money, right? And we can increasingly, worldwide, right? Like do you guys heard of social stratification as an idea? This is a major concept in sociology. Inequality is constantly growing. It has been for the last couple hundred years, really. So like, and it's even worse if you're talking worldwide. So we often talk about developing countries, but we don't really develop countries. In a lot of ways, we actually make countries poorer and poorer over time. So the divide between wealthier countries and poorer countries is increasing. It has been, particularly since the 1980s, right? And the creation of something called structural adjustment, where they force austerity. They force essentially the same process of cutting the government on poorer countries, right? So to give you an example, like when I studied in Senegal, it was illegal for them to have trash services in Senegal. So they didn't have any trash programs because it was illegal for their government to create them, right? Under the rules of their loans with other countries, like they couldn't have trash services. They also couldn't repair their sewer system. So like, you know, this essentially like they had a larger population than their sewer system could support, and the only way they could get rid of trash was by burning it in the street, right? That was enforced by the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This is what happens worldwide, right? Generally speaking, poorer countries are being forced into this position of, in a more drastic way than we are ourselves by choice, cutting their government. So the point where their government barely even exists, right? This is part of this discussion of the decline of the nation state. Do you have sovereignty as a country, right? We talked about sovereignty and the creation of boundaries, right? Do you have that anymore if other third-party institutions, particularly financial institutions, can just tell you that you have to get rid of your government, right? Not essentially not provide services with it. This is also a big thing around AIDS. Part of the spread of AIDS was the fact that we made it illegal for IMF and the World Bank put conditions on countries telling them that they couldn't provide medical services, which actually caused AIDS to spread in Africa a lot quicker than it would otherwise, right? So like here you get examples of this same process, creating the conditions, right, for people to immigrate. So the incentives for people to immigrate grows out of the poverty constructed by this same process. So in a weird way, what the article is suggesting is that the creation of private prisons, which is expanding its market into essentially immigrants, becoming a good chunk of the population, right, creating detention centers, which we kind of nodded at the creation of detention centers in the Southwest at the last class, right? That there is essentially all these sort of detention centers being built. They're largely being built by these corporations as they're being forced to scale back from actually creating prisons, right? So we are limiting the amount of private prisons, but now they're actually creating immigration detention centers, right? So we see privatization happening at one end. We also see privatization happening at the other end, right? That privatization is what's forcing immigration problems largely. And it's also kind of our solution to it, right? You guys see that? So that's what the article's trying to nod at, right? Questions or thoughts people have on this? Just keeping track of time. Yeah.
I'm just curious, what determines whether a prisoner goes to like a private prison or a state-run prison? Like, is it a specific crime, or is it just like all based on capacity, or?
So one thing, yeah, so it's going to depend on the situation, right? So it's going to depend on that state. So one thing is that federal prisons generally aren't private. The federal government usually runs a federal prison. It's at the state level that governments have private prisons. So that means that if you're creating a federal offense, so in a lot of ways it's your real like a lot of your harsher crimes are federal offenses, right? And those things are generally going to be you're going to be sent to a federal penitentiary, which is going to be run by the government. In a lot of ways, what private prisons specialize in then is going to be your more minor crimes, right? And so that's where we're actually going to send it. So in a weird way, often people who commit minor crimes end up in facilities where they're treated worse than the people who commit major crimes, right? Which is sort of a weird irony here. But other than that, yeah, it's going to be more dependent upon capacity. It might be dependent on what kind of, like what level of security the private prison is versus the public prisons. In some states, they've gotten rid of their public prisons pretty much altogether, and they're all private. So then, if you commit a crime in that state, you're going to go to a private facility. But back to, in the United States, there's actually kind of becoming a scale back on private prisons. There's been a lot of backlash on that. But rather than those companies just sort of like ceasing to exist, we see them moving into that other sector, right? So essentially they're getting forced out of the prison sector, but they're actually instead keeping and detaining immigrants instead, right? Makes sense. And historically, we haven't detained immigrants. Like, this is a very new thing. What do you think we used to do with illegal immigrants? Historically, what did the United States do with them? Does anybody know?
Do we just send them back?
Yeah, we deported them, right? We no longer deport our immigrants, we just hold them in place, right? Which is very different, right? And like, it's kind of a weird question. Why are we detaining people rather than just sending them back, right? And part of it is that because of this criminalization of that population, we can't keep up with the amount of people that we're locking up for immigration, right? So the court system can't actually handle it and process it, which means that we just keep people there forever, right? So that's actually kind of why, right? But historically, we haven't actually, right? It's only as a result of these sort of changes in policy that we actually detain them rather than just sort of like run them through the court system. Because they can essentially appeal that they're being deported, right? And so that's part of the problem here. Make sense? Do you have a question? It kind of looks like you did.
No, I was just curious because, like, for private prisons, typically, like the border patrol, let's just say they pay an immigrant, they would put them in there, but they're under border patrol custody. So I'm just I'm a little bit confused. Like, it's private prison and all, but they're still under border patrol custody. So
yeah, and this is kind of some of the weirdness when you start getting into privatization. Particularly in recent years, you had something referred to as private-public mergers. So it's like part of it is, so it's almost like they just mesh together rather than being like very clearly separate. So there's certain things that's very hard to privatize. And prisons are a good example of this, right? But essentially what they did is they created these sort of private-public mergers. So some of the people at that facility might actually be federal employees. Some of them won't be, right? The care that those people are going to get is going to be kind of like a negotiation between the two. Does that make sense?
yeah, no, I was just going to say that it's the border patrol that's bringing all the detainees in. It's not like the private company can't really tell the border patrol to go and arrest more people. It's the border patrol bringing them in, which is why we're kind of like overcrowding problems right now. So it wasn't so much like the company is actually, it needs the high thing, it's just getting it automatically.
Yeah, so in just to like, and this is just me like expressing how the article would discuss that, right? So the idea is that, you know, you have this sort of vested interest making sure that we criminalize, right, the immigrants, right? Once they're criminalized, right, and that's why a lot of them, so I talked about the driver's license one as an example, but this is sort of the significance of things like the school having to report, right? So this criminalization process also involves basically a way in which things then get to border control, right? They then get to the immigration, right? ISA, right? So isn't it ISA? ICE, yeah, you're right. So essentially like ICE gets alerted, right, because of these policies. So it essentially dumps a lot more work off onto ICE, right, in one way, right? But like, where before they mostly just dealt with problem cases. Historically, immigration has only really cared about illegal immigrants if they do something wrong. They get rid of them, right? But like, if they're just here like working some menial job that nobody wants anyways, they have a tendency just to look the other way, right? Historically. But essentially what state governments have done is they basically force them to have to pay attention to those populations to get them out more wholesale, right? So that's actually part of the problem, right? It's a very complicated issue, so you're right to point out, right? So like, this isn't me saying that you're wrong. I think that's how the author would want to frame it. But, you know, there's obviously other interpretations. And one thing is like this doesn't make any reference to like the Guatemalan refugee crisis, even though this is going on. And I think that's a little suspect. So I think you're right in saying that. I think the article presents a certain simplification, right? I think there's some truth to it, but it's also like a lot more complicated issue than we're actually seeing. Other questions or thoughts? Thank you for your input. Do you guys see how all this is interrelated then? Does all this work? Okay, cool. And once again, we can relate this to these ideas of national categories, right? So like we were talking about nationalism last class, right? Nationalism becomes this sort of like overarching ethnicity, right? It's an imagined ethnicity, but it's one that we kind of hold to, and it creates certain reactions, right, to immigration. So ironically, in this period where the state is declining, which you would kind of think that with the declining state, that nationalism would disappear, right? If we're getting the death of the nation state, right? The nation, you know, kind of thing, you would expect nationalism to decrease. But in reality, it actually increases nationalism because people are reacting to the fact that people are spreading across borders more, right? In a lot of ways, our imagined ethnicity is becoming more false every day. Right? It's always been, to some degree, a simplification, like we talked about before. But with sort of mass immigration, it's becoming more obvious that the boundary between this place and another place is largely meaningless. But that actually increases nationalism rather than decreases it. So people have a sort of hostile reaction to some of the effects of neoliberalism, right? Which is particularly the movement. Which once again feeds into this sort of idea of like, and a lot of the literature would go here, this sort of like looming threat of authoritarianism, right? Because if you sort of start sparking those nationalist sentiments, inevitably this is probably where it leads to, right? If people try to reduce, right, difference, there's a danger to that. Make sense? So I think the two pieces kind of tie together pretty well. That we've had on the one end on, you know, imagined ethnicity, and then on this end talking specifically about contemporary immigration problems. You guys done with immigration? Should we move on to Collins? Any other thoughts? Okay, cool. So just as a reminder, how about you guys tell me about where we just left off with Collins? Got to make sure to keep the big picture in mind here. Somebody can jump in while I clean the board. I kind of miss being able to use the whole board. Like when I'm videotaping it, it has this like, I have to stay in this narrow swath, and I still think I accidentally get outside of it. Okay.
We were talking about like objectification and like the images that people like think of when they think of like black women.
Yeah. So so we were talking specifically about images, right? Do you guys remember some of the images that we talked about?
There were mammies, matriarchs, and welfare queens.
Yeah.
So big three.
So which are those? And there's one that we like kind of talked about, but didn't quite because we were running out of class time. So what are the different images, right, that gets promoted of black women in the media?
The mammy is like nurturing and happy to wear desexualized. And then the matriarch is like a strong, aggressive black woman. And the welfare queen is like a nurturing mammy, as long as they take care of white kids, but as soon as they take care of their own kids, they're kind of seen like as the welfare queen.
Yeah, so this sort of like devaluation of black motherhood, right? This valuation of black women being subservient. And then what's the significance here of the image of strong black women? Because like we would normally think of that as something positive, but within the framing here, right, the image is actually a negative image. So what's the problem with the idea of the matriarch?
That they're too powerful and kind of like take over the man's job.
Yeah, yeah, so the idea is like they're presented as sort of this emasculating force, right? I don't mean to police, but you should get your mask back on. We're just being told to make sure that people in our classes do it. Otherwise we could end up having the county put us on quarantine again. Okay, yeah, so we have these images, right? And this is, so our next chapter moves from this sort of top-down idea, right? This sort of top-down that you have these images. I'm going to use, for the sake of here, the word ideology, which we'll talk about, right? So the idea that there's sort of these top-down images that are sort of forced upon our culture, and that essentially hurt black women, to instead talking about how is it that we see black women reacting to these images, right? If you feel familiar with the term ideology, this is a really normal term within sociology. What is ideology? Anyone remember this? Another class maybe? No? Ideology is the idea that there's sort of like messages within our culture that reinforce hierarchies. So there's sort of these latent messages within our culture that reinforce existing hierarchies the way that they are, right? And this is like, really any disenfranchised group, if you're watching like television in particular, like if you're watching televisions or movies, there's going to be portrayals of them, these sort of latent hidden messages, right? That essentially cause us to distrust and dislike certain populations. That's the idea here, right? So like, you know, this could be like the presentation of, you know, like this could be like the presentation of the redneck would be another example of a different form of ideology, right? So people from down south are presented as stupid and backwards, right? And we're going to talk about whiteness as a concept later, and we're going to see that portrayal being significant, right? So, so you have in that case, right, a specific group of people that's been that's traditionally fallen within a specific part of the hierarchy, beneath, you know, hierarchy between groups of people. If we were to use Collins' language, right, they fall within a certain place in the matrix of domination, right? In this case, often we're talking about social class, right? And that's used, that our culture often has these images that are used to reinforce that difference, right? So that people remain distrusting of that subset of the population, right? So that's essentially what she started with these controlling images, right? What she's calling controlling images is essentially ideology. There's an ideology surrounding black femininity, right? Just like there's an ideology that surrounds blackness. Often, if you turn on the TV and you see African Americans, there's going to be various ways in which they're portrayed, and those are going to mostly be either negative images, or they're going to be positive images, but have some sort of negative implication, right? You're very unlikely to see African Americans portrayed as protagonists, except in films designed specifically for African Americans, right? Why is that, right? It's because in some ways, like it's difficult for a white population to associate with an African American as a protagonist, but that reinforces these sort of images, right? Often when you do see African Americans on television, they're portrayed as criminals, they're portrayed as et cetera, right? All those things have reinforced the hierarchy between African Americans and Caucasians over time. So that's how this essentially works, right? So her images of the mammy, of the matriarch, of the welfare queen, the Jezebel is the one that we didn't really get to, right? And the Jezebel is essentially treating black women as hypersexual. All these are essentially a form of ideology that's imposed upon African American women and guide the way in which our culture views them in general. Okay, makes sense? Starting in the 1980s, there's kind of a backlash against this top-down understanding of hierarchy, of ideology. That people at the bottom rarely actually embrace the images that are given of them, right? It's the claim. But they often have to do this quietly. Okay, so I'll give you guys an example of how this works. So for a long time and particularly like ideology is a concept that comes out of Marxism, right? If you guys haven't caught on, Marxism is not a scare word in sociology, right? It's just considered another theoretical framework that we use. Anyway, so growing out of Marxism is this idea, right, of that people suffer under something called false consciousness, right? So false consciousness is essentially that you misunderstand the world around you as a result of ideology, right? And so traditionally within Marxism, the idea is that particularly the people at the bottom of the hierarchy sort of embrace their own mistreatment as a result of their false consciousness. So they act against their own interest. Right? So people act against their own interest politically.
Can you just repeat the definition of false consciousness one more time?
Yeah, so false consciousness is essentially that you have a misunderstanding of the world as a result of ideology. Right? So these ideological images, you see them, you embrace them, you internalize them, and they become part of how you see yourself, and this causes all these sort of misunderstandings, right? So this would assume what about our controlling images? And this is going to be very different from where Collins takes us. What would you assume about black women from a traditional Marxist framework? When black women interact with controlling images, how would they see themselves? As what? They'd see themselves as those images, right? They would see those as legitimate expressions of who they were, and they would act accordingly. So that's how traditional Marxism would have viewed this, right? They would have viewed it as essentially, so what Marxism would want to do is come along and replace false consciousness with something else that they call class consciousness. And within class consciousness, essentially what they'd be able to see is they'd be able to see that they were oppressed by these images and that they were oppressed by the economic system around them, and essentially they just had to be convinced of this. So I said in the 1980s and 1990s, they started to be distrusting of this narrative. Sociologists started to be very distrusting of this false consciousness narrative. And part of the reason why is that generally speaking, people who are oppressed, one, know that they're oppressed better than the people who are sort of outside this trying to convince them that they're oppressed. They know that they're oppressed, right? But they also know the limitations of their lives far better than anyone outside telling them what they should be doing. right? So what we often view as acting against their own interest isn't. So there's this, and it's kind of give an example of how this works, because I think it's a pretty striking image. There's this, this person who used to be kind of a hardcore Marxist who switches in, essentially this is more like theater theory kind of stuff, so performance theory, named Augusto Boal. And Augusto Boal is from Brazil. And so essentially, like when he's this sort of revolutionary Marxist, he's going around Brazil trying to convince the Indians to rise up and take their place, right, the indigenous people. So he's going around doing plays, right? And he shows up and he does a play in this town. And the leader of this village looks at him and is like, okay, yeah, let's do it. Let's go kill our masters, right? Like, you get your guns, we'll get our weapons, we'll go together. Let's do it. And Boal's like, our guns aren't real. They're made of wood. They don't do anything. And he's like, oh, so you just want me to go die, right? You don't want to do, right, this sort of like weird contradiction, right? The idea is this, that often what we view as like, and this was to some degree the problem of things like revolutionary Marxism, what we often view as in the interest of people who are oppressed aren't, right? We don't understand the limitations. So often people fight back in really quiet ways, right? Another theorist named James Scott likes to talk about what he calls hidden transcripts. That if we want to understand how oppressed people understand and think about themselves, we have to understand it through a hidden transcript, right? That there's an official transcript, an official narrative about people, right? So in this case, thinking about Collins's images, right? The official transcript being promoted here is one in which African American women should mostly be working, are happy with their work, are devalued, like should be devalued when they're mothers because they're taking advantage of the system when they're mothers, and that they should be, you know, that they're sexually promiscuous, that they write. That's the official transcript, right? That's the official message you're going to get. But there's a hidden transcript, right? That African American women understand about themselves, right? But aren't a part of our public discourse, right? Scott starts his major book on this, a book called The Weapons of the Weak, with a proverb, an Ethiopian proverb, which goes, a wise man kneels before his king and silently farts, right? So like the idea is like, poor people often understand that if they're openly disrespectful, or if they're openly antagonistic, or if they're openly aggressive, what's going to happen to them? What happens if you're in open defiance? If you're at the bottom of a hierarchy and you're open defiance, what do you think is going to happen to you? What happens to most people who rebel in one way or another?
They get squashed.
They get squashed, yeah. We want to look at the long history of political actions of poor people, right? Whenever poor people decide that they don't want to be poor anymore and take action about it, usually they get killed, right? Most political movements, that, you know, you can take most of like things like a good chunk of the civil rights leaders in the 60s got killed. A good chunk of the separatist movements of Black Panthers, what happened to those figures? Most of them got killed. Right? They got killed or they got imprisoned, right? So like, what happens when you take direct political action? The system acts against you, right? The system acts back, and the system is stronger than you. So James Scott and others in this vein of thinking about political action are basically like, you should understand that most people who are oppressed know that. They know that how they can act and they know how they can't. And they act in subtle ways, right? Subtle forms of disagreement. So like, you know, if you are essentially like working for a company that pays you so little you can't live off of it, you might do things like mild forms of theft from your company as a way of substituting your income, right? It's an act of rebellion in a certain way, but it's not as big a one, right? It's not like you're gonna just be like, I'm going to trash this place and steal the money or whatever, right? Like none of this bold action that Marxists would have wanted, right? Instead, it's very subtle action, right? Very quiet action, right? Make sense? So in particular, what Collins is going to pull us to in this chapter is all the ways in which black women manage over the years to have this sort of what she's referring to as black women consciousness. So essentially, when in any sort of what she's calling free spaces, right? Spaces where black women can actually express themselves. She gives examples of black churches and various organizations where black women are capable of expressing themselves. Also, this long literary tradition that she's pulling off of, you know, black women's poetry, black women as, you know, sort of like political analysts, right? All these sort of things that she pulls from earlier, if you remember back, right? Are all expressions of this sort of consciousness that black women have, but aren't a part of that official discourse, right? So over time, they're capable of sort of reinforcing and controlling amongst themselves the image of how they understand themselves, right? In contra to the official narrative, the official transcript of these sort of controlling images. You guys see how that works? So it's sort of an inversion, right? So like, another way to put it is increasingly, and Collins is one of these figures, increasingly we have to understand how oppressed groups interact with ideology is often like ways in which they rebel against it in very quiet ways, right? What does that mean for most people though? So let's say rather than being, in this case, being a black woman, how are most people viewing black women still? Did you? Oh, I thought I saw you. How are they viewing them? Through what? If it's a hidden transcript of like what black women actually feel and think about themselves. How are most of us still viewing them?
Through the controlling images.
Yeah, through the controlling images, right? So essentially what Collins' project is to make this more explicit, right? To essentially bring this before people, right? And there's also like, if you remember, right, like where we started with, according to Collins, like African American women within American society formulate a certain place within this matrix of domination. What was that place? Thinking back to it. This is the intersectionality stuff. What's the place? What makes African American women significant within our system, according to Collins? Different from other populations. Keep in mind, this is a book about intersectionality. So if there's one thing we should definitely get walking away from this, it's society of intersectionality. What was intersectionality? Yeah? Oh, you just have a pen up. Do you know the answer? What was intersectionality? I'll give you guys a moment to look over your notes. Yeah, go ahead.
Different categorizations we give people kind of overlap, so it's not just black people as a whole, it's black women, black men, or like lesbian black women, or all the different in between categories, I guess.
Yeah. So basically it's that there's a lot of different hierarchies sitting next to each other or interacting with one another within our society, right? So we have class hierarchies, we have racial hierarchies, we have gender hierarchies, we have sexuality hierarchies, we have all kinds of hierarchies, right? And none of us fall in just one category, right? So all of us most of us are some combination of being both oppressed and oppressor, right? But the more categories in which you fall at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? In some ways for Collins, the more you are capable of understanding sort of like the oppression of the system, right? So like the significance of black women for Collins is that they're black, they're predominantly poor, and they're predominantly women, right? So like, or they're predominantly poor and they're women, right? So they fall within this specific place within this matrix of different hierarchies, right? It's a matrix, they overlap, they intertwine, right? That's the whole idea of intersectionality, they intersect, right? So these intersecting hierarchies, right, create African American women within a specific place towards the bottom, right? And actually you made reference to in the sexuality chapter, which I'm going to only talk about in a cursory kind of way. That's the significance of like when she's talking about lesbianism and African American women's hostility towards lesbianism. Is that essentially like it's the one hierarchy that they're not actually like at the intersection of. So often African American women end up dumping on, right, homosexual women within their own culture. But getting back to this idea, right, so the significance of black women's consciousness for her, right, is that in essence, like if we draw attention to black women's consciousness, it kind of happens at this intersection where other forms of consciousness, right, can be constructed, right? So because it falls at that intersection, it's significant, right? So like it helps us show the ways in which black consciousness becomes necessary, or class consciousness, or gender consciousness, or et cetera, right? So the ways in which everybody at the bottom of a hierarchy in some ways creates, right, these spaces in which they interact about their own oppression and the significance of it, right? So she sort of views it almost like, whether we want to take this as true or not, right, in a movement sense, she sort of views African American women as sort of the forefront, the avant-garde of, right, of challenging existing images, challenging ideology through their own consciousness. Make sense? Because how is it that you bring down ideology? Like the idea here is that it's through the consciousness of poor people that we actually see a real threat, right, to existing ideologies. Which actually for Collins is where we see the real threat to existing forms of hierarchy. As long as we feel like hierarchies are fine and dandy and there's no reason to challenge them, nothing will happen. Right? We'll just have increasing inequality, increasing gender inequality, increasing class inequality, increasing race inequality. As long as we feel like it's legitimated, as long as we feel like it should exist, it'll self-perpetuate. Right? The only challenge of it comes from people actually understanding, right, and challenging that ideology. Okay. Any thoughts on that? We have a little more time. Do people have any questions or thoughts or concerns they want to share? Yeah.
Just some clarification.
Yeah,
The home is Friday or do?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, just thinking.
If it's on the syllabus for this week, yeah, it's due Friday, 11:59. Other questions? Yeah.
Okay, I just had a question about like one of the questions on the take home.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I was just wondering when I was looking over my notes about like the imagined community.
Yeah.
So I was confused like about how we were talking about like a lot of people spoke Latin. Like, did that make them feel like a community, or was it more of the printing press that made them feel like a community?
Oh yeah. It's a transition into the imagined community of nations, right? So like for Benedict, there was that sort of like spiritual Latin community which predated it, right? That was like the older form of community that was being built. And it was to some degree, and this might be where you're getting a little, like, got a little confused, to some degree that also was imagined according to Benedict Anderson, right? But then that was replaced by these national cultures, right? So the printing press, the fracturing of the church through Protestantism sort of ended that sort of idea of the spiritual community of Europe, right, Christendom. And it was instead replaced by these national categories with their own languages, with supposedly their own cultures, each independent, right? So he was showing in that discussion, he was showing this transition. Make sense?
Yeah, cool.
Other questions people have? And feel free to pop up the take-home, and if you have other questions on it, like we can talk about that. In the last few minutes here. And if you want to look over it, and if you have questions at the beginning of class, next class period, you can do that too. If you guys want time to kind of start working on it and see if there's any confusion, I'm happy to clear things up. Yeah.
Okay, I just had another question.
Yeah, totally.
About like the scientific racism. And then
Yeah.
you said like, how does that differ from other forms of racism?
Yeah.
Do you mean like organic racism, kind of like how we usually kind of think about racism now, or like, yeah?
Yeah, and that's what I had in mind there is we sort of started with one version of racism, right? When we talked about like the birth of racism and colonialism, if you think of that Hannah Arendt reading, right? And then we have scientific racism, and I'm kind of looking for a comparison between those
Okay.
two.
Yeah, and is organic racism, like, would you say that's kind of how we think of race? Because like, I don't know, I feel like scientific racism, I usually don't like hear people talking about that, you know, like.
Yeah, well, I think today, so if we're thinking about racism today, I think it ends up becoming like I think it influenced our racial discourse,
Okay.
right? Because like often people will think about the world specifically in a very evolutionary way, right? And that often gets tied in with things about race, right? So a lot of times we have seen racism be heavily influenced by that, even when it comes to direct action. So it's sort of like a way to think about it is like you had organic racism, and then scientific racism sort of bolstered that, but then they kind of at some point became intertwined,
Okay.
you know? And now we sort of we live in sort of like this weird aftermath where like a lot of us don't necessarily believe in that sort of like hard scientific racism kind of form of racism, but we have these sort of lingering after effects which are really significant. And so race as a concept, basically, once the cat was out of the bag as a concept, it's really hard to end, right, thinking about the world in terms of race. Okay, other questions? Cool. I'll let you guys out a little early today then. We'll talk about more chapters of Collins. We're all getting very close to being through Collins. I think we only have one more week, I believe, after this, or maybe it's 2 more weeks. Anyways, pretty soon we're going to turn to just having dual readings. So, have a good day.